Hey there, eighth graders. How you doing? This is Mr. Garnett Cook. I hope you've had a good weekend. We are entering the final week of our unit on immigration. I'll say a little bit more at the end of this screencast about where we're headed after this. The focus of our final week's work is going to be immigration today, and particularly looking at immigration in the Trump era. And with that, we're going to focus on a couple of specific issues that have been issues that have dominated the discussion around immigration, particularly since President Trump took office 3 years ago. I want to begin actually with the president, with Donald Trump, and with a quote from his campaign announcement from June of 2015. So in June of 2015, he announced he was running for president. And during that announcement, he said the following: "When do we beat Mexico at the border? They're laughing at us, at our stupidity. And now they are beating us economically. The US has become a dumping ground for everybody else's problems. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. And some, I assume, are good people. But I speak to border guards and they tell us what we're getting. It's coming from more than Mexico. It's coming from all over South and Latin America, and it's coming probably from the Middle East. But we don't know because we have no protection and we have no competence, and we don't know what's happening. And it's got to stop, and it's got to stop fast." So here was then candidate Donald Trump announcing his campaign for president and making very clear on that day that immigration, and particularly reducing immigration, was going to be one of his big issues. A couple things to emphasize here. Number one, a lot of people found factual errors in some of the assumptions that he was making here around crime and things like that. I'm not going to get too deep into that here, but you definitely see in this quote some of the things that we've learned in this unit about people's anxieties around immigration, fear of crime, fear of changing culture, fear that immigrants are going to come and are going to drag down the American economy. We also see here an implied criticism of his predecessor, Barack Obama. He talks about we have no protection and we have no competence. He's not saying Obama's name, but at the time he said that, President Obama was still in office. So we see here Donald Trump echoing some themes of immigration history, particularly people's fears and anxieties around immigration. And that has continued to be an issue since he became president. So I'm going to be focusing a little bit on some of the issues that influence America today, and specifically American immigration. Let's just do a quick review. We've learned a little bit about immigration in the modern era very early in this unit. Some of you really learned in depth about the modern period in immigration. And one of the things that makes immigration from 1965 to the present different from previous generations is where immigrants are coming from. And this is information, if you've been doing the work all along, you know this. You know that for much of America's immigration history, immigrants are coming primarily from Europe. You can see that in these various pie graphs. And as you get into the 20th century, it becomes a little bit more diverse. But look what's happened in the last 40, 50 years here. If you look at this pie graph on the right, you'll notice that a lot of immigrants are coming from North and South America. That would be the Caribbean, Latin America, and a lot of immigrants are coming from Asia. You have immigrants coming from Africa. So it's a very different immigrant population from that which would have come here a century or a century and a half ago. That is one of the byproducts of the law that was passed in 1965, which I'll come back to a little bit more in just a minute. I also want to talk about another issue that's become a big political issue in recent times, and that's the issue of what is called undocumented immigrants or illegal immigrants. Some call them unauthorized immigrants. That is an issue that a lot of politicians have been talking about over the course of the last, say, 20, 30 years. A couple of interesting images here. The one on the left is a map of the United States, and it shows you the metropolitan areas in the United States with the largest number of undocumented immigrants. You can see the West Coast here, Los Angeles. You can see Texas, cities like Houston. You can see Miami down here. You can see New York has a large undocumented immigrant population. And Boston, you can see up here, also has a modest undocumented immigrant population. Geographically, it's interesting to note that the undocumented immigrant population primarily along the coasts, okay, West Coast, East Coast, southern border, not so much in the interior part of the country, which is interesting because politically, the places in the country where you often hear the most not anti-immigrant, but certainly people that have a hard line around undocumented immigrants comes from the interior parts of the country, places where undocumented immigrants are in much smaller numbers. This graph here on the right shows you the rise in the undocumented immigrant population over the course of the last 40 years or so. You can see here how it started to rise throughout the 90s. You'll notice that it continued to go up and up and up and up and up until about 2007, 2008, which was when Obama came into office. Then it kind of flatlined, plateaued, and it's actually gone down slightly over the course of the last few years. It's very difficult to get accurate numbers around undocumented immigration because it's hard to count them. But the estimates are right now we're somewhere in the 10 million range in terms of people who are currently living in this country who are not authorized. Undocumented or illegal immigration could exist for a number of reasons. There are people who cross the border illegally. That is certainly a big contributor. Another contributor has to do with people who come here legally as on what are called visas, legal permission to enter the country. Sometimes it's student visas, sometimes it's travel visas or work visas, people who have permission to come here for set periods of time and simply overstay the length of their visa. And when their visa expires, if they're still here, they haven't left, they become unauthorized, illegal, undocumented, however you want to whatever you want to call it. So the undocumented immigrant population is a kind of a complicated issue. This is another issue that has been a part of the American discussion around immigration over the course of the last 20 years, and that has to do with the refugee population, people who are coming here fleeing political unrest or coming here because they fear for their lives, people who are coming here seeking protection in the United States. And if you look at this graph, you'll notice that there's a sharp drop-off right after the year 2000. That's because of the 9/11 attacks. But it starts to go up. And then, starting around the time that Barack Obama came into office, you had an increase in the number of refugee arrivals in the United States. And then it continues to be fairly high until you get to 2017. And then there is a sharp, dramatic drop-off. You'll notice that. And that is the presidency of Donald Trump. Because when Donald Trump became president, there was a dramatic cutback in the number of refugees being allowed into the United States. So that's another big issue that has dominated discussion on immigration over the course of the last 20, 30 years or so. I want to talk a little bit about the political spectrum. Back in the fall, we learned about what it means to be left or liberal or right and conservative or in the center, and Democrat and Republican. I just want to give you a snapshot of where the different ends of the political spectrum are on the issue of immigration. We'll start with the left. So left, liberals, Democrats. Modern times, there are a lot of different issues. You can get into some real specifics, but three general points that you often hear on the left. One is that we need to have a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. There are a lot of people living here illegally, and we need to create a mechanism where they can become legal residents of the United States and eventually citizens. They especially mention children of undocumented immigrants, kids who came here with their parents. Their parents may have come here illegally, but the kids themselves, a lot of people on the left will say, should not be punished for that. Border security should focus on criminals. So you should focus on people who are coming here with the intent of committing crimes. People who are smuggling drugs, for example, things like that. Criminal enforcement of the law and sort of arresting people should be limited to that. not so much to people who are coming here seeking a better life or fleeing unrest in their own countries or things like that. So border security should focus just on people who are coming here to break the law, to do criminal activity. And then finally, fixing the broken immigration system. You will often hear people on the left saying, look, the immigration system is too complex, it is too difficult to get here illegally. You have to wait in line sometimes for months, maybe years. And this is actually contributing, some would say, to the number of people trying to get here illegally. So those are often points you hear on the left. On the right, there's much more emphasis on border security and enforcement of the law. So, particularly with Donald Trump, border security has been a big issue. Enforcement of immigration law, cracking down on undocumented immigrants is a big issue. And particularly since Trump took office, reducing annual immigration, cutting down the number of people coming into the country. A lot of people on the right will say that you need to protect American jobs, and that you can't have competition, too much competition, particularly when the economy is not so good. You don't want competition. You don't want immigrants being able to compete with people already living here for jobs. And that's something you will often hear on the right. So that's a pretty good snapshot of where the left and the right are on immigration today. A little bit about the historical background for immigration today. Things that have happened that have shaped America's immigrant population today, and also immigration issues today that dominate in the news. The first goes back to 1965, the Immigration Act of 1965 that ended the quota system and led to a dramatic expansion of immigration to the United States. Wasn't necessarily the intent of that law. That's a longer story that I'm not going to get into now. But it did lead to a dramatic rise in the number of people coming here. And also, as we've already talked about, where people are coming from. So our immigrant population today is to a large degree influenced by that law and the changes it brought about. You also have the Immigration Act of 1986 that established penalties for employers who hire undocumented immigrants. That's its own complicated story. I won't get into too much now. But it also created a path to legal status for undocumented immigrants who are already living here. It was the last time, really, that there was immigration law that provided a path to legal residency in the United States for people who were not living here legally. 9/11, the 9/11 attacks led to a couple of significant changes. One was the creation of what is called the Department of Homeland Security, and also the creation of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, commonly known as ICE. And you will often hear about ICE in the news when you hear about immigrants who are being rounded up and deported for not being here legally or maybe being in violation of the law. It's often ICE agents who are doing it. ICE has been a big political issue in the last couple of years. And an increased focus since 9/11 on security and deporting criminals, people not living here legally. So there was a real shift after 9/11. The election of Donald Trump certainly was a big turning point. He comes into office, and there is a real shift in immigration policy away from the policies of Barack Obama. And the President Trump has taken a much harder line on immigration over the course of the last 3 years. Some of you may have been following that in the news. And then finally, it's not an insignificant thing here at all. The expansion of cable news, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, the rise of talk radio, and the rise of social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, other social media platforms where people are expressing their views on immigration, they're debating immigration, sometimes using really harsh language to describe immigrants, to describe immigration policies. The expansion of news sources has changed the way people talk about immigration in sometimes not in good ways. And that is an ongoing dilemma in America. Back when we learned about media literacy, you may remember we learned about how bias in the news can shape people's views on a lot of different issues. I'll end with this, and then I'll talk about the assignments for the week and where we're headed next. These are various pictures of immigrants, and it's important to point out that America has a large and vibrant immigrant population living in this country today. Immigrants who come from all over the world, who are involved in America's economic life, who are involved in America's political life, and are out there expressing their point of view and fighting for their rights as people. We You can go through Brookline, Boston, Newton, all the towns in the area and see clear, unmistakable evidence of vibrant immigrant communities contributing to the social, political, and economic life of this country. And it's happening in the midst of sometimes very heated political debates in this country around immigration. This week, you're going to have the opportunity to hear some immigrant stories. There's a video that you will have the opportunity to watch where you'll see some immigrants talking about their experiences here in America, how they feel to be here, how easy or difficult it's been to adjust to life in America. You'll also have an opportunity to dive in a little bit deeper into important immigration issues. One of the assignments this week will give you the option of choosing from one of three major political issues that dominate American discussion on immigration today. You'll have an opportunity to learn about the history of that issue, to explore a current event connected to that issue. So you get a little bit of a deeper dive this week into immigration in America today, particularly in the Trump years. So that's what we're going to be finishing with this week. Next week, we're going to be shifting our attention to America in the Great Depression and World War II era. And that's what we will be finishing this year with. Anyway, I hope you all have a good week. Email me if you have any questions. And until then, take care.